Okay, great. All systems go. All right, in that case, good evening. Welcome to number 5. This is the 3-week series of 2025, which is about Jews and assimilation. It's a total of 6 lectures we planned, and today's number 5, as you can see, is called The Challenge of the First Half of the Modern Era, and it's being sponsored by the Tarragons and the Lightmans, by Tobin Allen Tarragon, in honor of all the brave soldiers who are serving in the IDF. Hashem protect them. I know that they have at least one relative that was wounded, and so our prayers are there. And by Noah and Ellen Lightman, in memory of Noah's brother Ezra, Ben Sion Lightman, whose years were short, but whose deeds were legendary. I did not know, but Karen did from the NCSY, and I've only heard great things about him. So I hope this will be a tribute to Neshama Shama Ben Aliyah, as they say. Again, as always, we want to thank the Shul for sponsoring over here. You have to be, can't be Kafri Tov, and our tech team, and I think we'll get underway. Okay? So tonight we're dealing with what we call the modern era, okay? Which in Jewish history usually means from 1789, that's the French Revolution. That's usually how it did. Now again, these are not hard and fast, but this is the general sort of trend. And I say 1799 to 1920 because now we're kind of like in the postmodern era, so to speak. Very often they speak of after 1945 as being postmodernism. But you know what I mean, modern era. Now, as far as we're concerned, the modern era is the big change. Until the modern era, there wasn't big radical assimilation. But there sure as heck is, starting around the French Revolution in 1800, that's, to use simple language, that's when all the Jews become not religious. So millions assimilate, let's put it that way, in unprecedented ways. That's the definition of the modern era in Jewish history. So once again, there are coincidences. In European history, in Western Civ, the French Revolution is a game changer. Not the same way in Jewish history, but nevertheless, important differences kick in, as we shall see, around that time. So again, this is something that affects the millions. Now, there are millions. One of the most unknown stories of the modern era in Jewish history is the fact there was a tremendous baby boom, the like of which has never been seen, in the 1800s. Look at this. Look at the numbers.
Wow.
Okay? 1820, 2.5 million Jews in the whole world. And then in 1880, it like triples, right? And in what? In 60 years. I mean, how'd they do that? Right? And then, and by the way, it all happens in Eastern Europe. It doesn't happen anywhere else. So, must have been something in the water. Anyway, by 1900, so in 20 years, it went up 1.5 million. By 1939, that's the most we've ever been in recorded history. So in other words, 16.5 million. Today, we haven't reached that yet, right? And I say maybe because it's, how you play with the numbers. Remember, Disraeli said there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. You understand? So, do you count somebody who feels they're Jewish, or this, and what about halachic definitions and all the rest of it? But let's be generous and say it's 15 million. So that's pretty sad what I just told you. It's 80 years since the Holocaust and have not recovered. Now, in tonight's lecture, the Jewish population, therefore, is exploding, if I'm talking about the modern era, right? Think about that. This itself is going to play strains on the old Judaism. We forget what the role that demography plays, but I'll give it to you in simple terms. Suppose you have a school, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. So it was a school called TA, and it was designed for 500 to 1,000 kids. And now I tell you, a whole bunch of people moving into town, and we need 5,000 kids. You can't handle that. 10,000 kids. Who can handle 10,000 kids? 20,000 kids. Meaning the numbers itself, explosion of numbers, is almost like a chemical change, you see? So don't be surprised if the old Judaism comes under strain and even breaks in the context of exploding numbers of Jews. The story tonight is the story of Jews in the diaspora, in the Galut, in somebody else's land, in other words, okay? And what happens when the rules change, because that's the trouble with being in Gullus. That's the trouble with being a minority in somebody else's country. You can't plan for the unforeseen, and the unforeseen always happens. So who here thought this guy's going to be mayor of New York, and this guy's going to be the new Walter Cronkite. And we never heard of these people years ago. And it was not possible in America for American Jewry or the Anti-Defamation League and all those other big organizations to figure this is going to happen. Because you plan your life that everything's going to be the way it is right now. Even though we know that in 10 years it won't be the same way right now. You plan your retirement as going to be this and this and this. But you know when 5 or 10 years or whatever comes by, you're not going to be in the same shape. And the economy will be different. And the demography may be different. And so on and so forth. So this is the trouble with being a minority. And this is the history of the Jewish people in Golis. Okay? And it happened in the modern era. Just when the Jews thought in Europe that they had the rules of living in Europe down, the rules changed for a variety of reasons. So over the course of centuries, the Jews had, for better or worse, worked out this system, with the non-Jews, that they have autonomous coercive communities and they're by themselves and they're a tolerated minority and this and that and the other, and you have the right to persecute us, but if they kill us and so on and so forth. We thought we knew the rules, and then all of a sudden, what we call the modern era, or a little bit before the beginning of the modern era, the rules changed. First of all, the state came into being in the 1700s, in the 18th century. The state, which became a centralizing, totalizing monopoly, gathering all power to itself. In the old days in Europe, and this is true in many Middle Eastern and African and Asian countries today, power is diffused. You understand? To use simple language for you, militias, gangs, people run around. And so the central government's not necessarily in control of everything. You understand? Especially when you have a polyglot situation. So this province is inhabited by these types of people, and that one is inhabited by that tribe, and this, that, and the other. We're not used to that, because we're used to the state. And the state was something that came into being 1700s. They called the guy called the king, or something like that. And he took away all the power from the nobles. And he said, all the power to kill anybody is in my hands. Nobody can kill anybody without me saying so, right? Hegel's definition of the state is that which has the right to kill you. You understand? Let me put it this way. Baltimore, Maryland, under certain circumstances, if they pass this and this law, and you violate that law, could kill you. The state of Maryland could do it. The federal government could do it. If there's a such and such a law, and you break that and that law, and this and that and the other, right? It could happen. Nobody else. Nobody else. That's called civilized society. You see? So that's new. Used to be any nobleman could do anything to anybody who was one of his peasants or serfs, or any high churchman or something like that. So in that society, there are a lot of different power groups, and it's not one, and therefore don't be surprised if the king has the royal law, and this one has the nobles law, and this one has the church law, and the Jews have the Jewish law. There's another group out there. But once the state becomes what you and I call the modern state, there's no room left for Jewish autonomy, which has been the bedrock of Jewish culture forever. One of the 4 pillars that I always put up, I'll put up later, is the autonomous coercive community, the Kill of yesteryear, in which all the Jews were members of that and paid their taxes to that, and that's how they dealt with the regular governments. And now this is being pulled. In the second half of the 18th century, before the French Revolution, you already start to have state after state in Europe pulling the power of the Jewish courts. Now, everybody here is so modern that you think it's a good idea, right? In other words, do I want a Beis Din to go and take my house away? I want that only to be the power of the city of Baltimore, or the state of Maryland, or the federal government, because they can take your house away, and they can do other stuff to you. I don't want an ecclesiastical court. Now the Muslims want it, they want the Sharia law, and people say, oh, I don't want that, okay? But once upon a time, that is how Jews lived, okay? That's how Jews lived. So in the second half of the 18th century, they start to pull these laws, and now they come up with this idea, one law for literally everybody, as opposed to the pre-modern system. This is how Europe operated for many, many, many centuries. Different courts operate under Roman law, customary law. What is customary law? Minhag. You know what I'm saying? So let me tell you something. In Germany, in the old days, if you kill somebody, you kill somebody. If you go by Roman law, you're chayiv misa. But if you go by old Germanic law from the tribes, you can get a lawyer, you can go to the other side and pay him off. Vergeld, it's called. You see? So let's say you got into a fight in a bar and you killed some guy named Harry. Who was a jerk? but you killed somebody. Well, a representative from your side will go to Harry's family and say like this, listen, if you want, I can raise $200,000 and give it to you in cash, and we'll make the whole thing go away. Agreed or not agreed? Then a very interesting family council gets together, and they start to say like this, Harry was a jerk anyway, and for 200 grand, especially if we split it between the three of us, we could do something with that. And the deal's, that's how they did business. By the way, this is also true in the biblical period. One of the 613 mitzvahs is you're not allowed to do that. It's one of the 613 mitzvahs. Lo sikhu kofrel nefesh rotzeach, it says. So you see, at that time there was such a thing. There's the law of the nobles that they passed. There's the law of the church. There's the law when you get a parliament of some sort or another in the Middle Ages. Right? Not necessarily a parliament that we have it now, but the estates, as they used to call it. Then you have the Jewish law, meaning external, that is to say, the laws that the state says happens if there's a case, for example, between a Jew and a non-Jew. Right? How do you regulate that? You go to a Jewish court, you go to a non-Jewish court. And then there's the Jewish law internal. The state has to agree to that also, that the Jews govern according to these rules, any problems among themselves. And then you got the king's law. And they all operate in the jungle, and they thought that's the way it's supposed to be, because after all, that reflects the reality. Are you going to tell me that in the old days, long ago, you're going to tell me it's the same thing if a peasant kills a peasant or if a peasant kills a nobleman? Come on. And are you going to tell me it's the same thing if a peasant kills a nobleman or a nobleman kills a peasant? Come on. You see? But these ideas are changing. And if they're changing, the Jewish autonomy is going to go out the window. Even Poland, backwards Poland, abolished the Vad Abarotzos in 1764. Right? They said we want to have just one law for everybody, which is like shocking. Okay? Now, that's number one. Number two, the Enlightenment in Europe, because as I told you last time, Europe in the Middle Ages was all religious. It was dominated totally by religion. But starting the Renaissance, it starts to open up. So the 1400s like this, a little bit of secularism. In the 1500s, in the 1600s, when you get to the 1700s, already more, it's called the Enlightenment. You see? Heavier dose of that. It brought in its wake not simply a bunch of new ideas, but specifically as regards the Jews, the Enlightenment in Europe brought in its wake an unprecedented pressure for Jews to change, to assimilate to the non-Jewish majority. This is a very complex story of civil rights for the Jews in a European, not in an American context, and herein lies the tale, because it's not like America. Once upon a time, for example, there are all these laws on the books against the Jews. Why not? It's a Christian country. The Jews are not Christian. Why shouldn't there be all these laws in the books? And if it's the 1700s, the most prominent Jew in Europe was Moses Mendelssohn. He could read or write other languages. He was a celebrated author. True, he was a weirdo, that he still practiced Judaism. They said that's true. But nevertheless, he's like a civilized person. The Jews in France, in Alsace-Lorraine, because France had annexed Alsace-Lorraine, and as a booby prize, they got 40,000, 50,000 Jews. And these are very religious Jews. I'll call them Yekish Hasidim. Right? It's not a far from the truth. And long ago, let me put it this way. Who was the big rabbi in Alsace-Lorraine at the time I'm talking about? The Chagas Aryeh. You see? So the Jews in France asked Moses Mendelssohn, listen, the government of King Louis the 16th, Marie Antoinette, is going to pass a new gezerah against us. We don't even know how to write French very well and all the rest of it. But you do. You know how to talk to the guy, and please write him a letter, a memo, and explain why this is not a good idea. So the guy who did it was a court Jew, Serf Bear, right? And he was the rich Jew in Alsace because he supplied the army, with horses and with fodder and all kind of stuff like that. So he always had what they call hofjude, you understand? A court Jew. But he doesn't know French very well. He's like these guys that we used to have in Baltimore years ago. They were millionaires. They couldn't sign English except that they want a check, right? You remember those. And they were successful business people. And so he says to this guy in Berlin, you're educated, you understand, so you write it. And he, Moses Mendelssohn, got a friend of his who was not Jewish, who was the assistant secretary of the Treasury in Prussia, an educated guy, Christian Wilhelm Blum. And they wrote up a whole memo, okay? And he asked, by the way, the Jews in Alsace, he asked this guy, so what do you want me to say? What would What is the ideal situation for you? He would never dream to give us civil rights. That's beyond. He said, how about an upgrade? Let us keep our autonomous, coercive community and ease up on the taxes a little bit in some of these economic decrees. So in other words, a tolerant Christian state is the ideal, okay, before Mashiach. It's the ideal. It doesn't get better than that. So can you appeal to that? And it worked, okay? It was a success because the French government was persuaded. And that led Mendelssohn, let's go back one, that led Mendelssohn to say, maybe the non-Jews in Europe are amenable to reason. So he said like this to his friend, who was not Jewish. Again, he was a deputy treasury secretary. He asked his friend, I can't write a book advocating for Jewish civil rights or a civil upgrade because they'll say you're Jewish. But you're not. So will you do me a favor and write a book like that? And he did. That's the next one. He wrote a book called, what do you call it? In favor of the civil betterment of the Jews. In other words, not civil rights, chas v'chalila, but an upgrade. Make the tax a little bit easier, stop all these stupid laws about you can't go into this business or that enterprise or live in this neighborhood, like that. And basically, this guy was not Jewish. So he's not going to say I love the Jews because he didn't. But he said, give the Jews an upgrade and we'll encourage their assimilation. Which is a good argument to make for Goyim in Europe in 1779. That's the argument, okay? Because he said, listen, what do you want? We put them in ghettos. We make all these laws against them. Naturally, they're going to have to go into smuggling and this, and breaking the law. Because you make it, you tie their hands economically. So what do you expect? But if you treat them better, they'll respond by getting better. To him, getting better is to assimilate. Okay? Obviously, the best way of getting better is to convert. So this is what it was. The popular reaction in Germany was, Lech Lazazel. They don't want to hear this at all. They said, how much did the Jews pay you? And so on and so forth. They didn't listen to it. But not everybody. The Austrian emperor read the book and he liked it. Okay? Joseph II. Let's go to the next one. This is the son of Maria Theresa. He's the famous enlightened despot. Right? You saw the movie about Mozart, Amadeus. He's the emperor. Right? So the Austrian Empire is a big country in the middle of Europe. Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, it's all one big blob. And there are a lot of Jews there, especially in Bohemia. And by this time they even had Galicia, which had an extra million Jews. So he issued the Edict of Toleration, the Toleranz Patent. But what did he say? I'm willing to ease up on you and give you a civic upgrade. What do you give me back? It's a quid pro quo. Right? I'll do something for you. What are you doing for me? What do you do for me? I'll take a step towards you. And I ease up a little, you assimilate a little. The implication is I ease up a little more, you assimilate a little more. Now, what does this mean? The traditionalist Jews were worried because what's the agenda over here? After all, has this guy simply become a nice person? No. It's all based on utility. What can we get better use out of our Jews? So the big rabbi at that time of the Austrian Empire was the Noda Yehuda, and he said like this, define a little. What do you mean you want us to assimilate a little? Okay? Well, the emperor sent his minister of education, Count Schulstein, very famous person actually, and he said, well, how about learning German? I'm not saying get rid of the cheder, but in addition to the cheder, have what you and I today would call English in the afternoon. You see? Or German in that case in the afternoon. Up to the 6th grade. Secular schooling for one. Regulated by the state. Okay? Under the Ministry of Education. Now, the Noda Yehuda didn't want to do it, but it's a long story, but he was forced to go along with it because they kept saying, well, you give your approval, why not? Tell me what I need to do to get your approval. And he had to go along with it. And now you have a Jewish secular school subject to government regulations. He was assured it won't be bad, they won't hurt the Jewish religion, anything like that. He didn't believe it, but it happened, and this is huge. This is in 1772, I think. 1782. So this is huge. For the first time, a non-Jewish government sticks its nose into the chinuch. Never happened before. Wherever the Jews lived, whether they lived in ghettos or things like that, the attitude of the non-Jewish society is pay the taxes, which are always 2 and 3 times everybody else's, and be of use to us in some way or another. And what you do on your own in those stupid synagogues and schools and then, boy, who cares? Because the whole Jewish thing is a bunch of junk. And the Jews, of course, are like this. Good. Keep your nose out of our internal business. You see? And for century after century, the Jews had their cheters and all that kind of thing, and yeshivas. And the outside world approached it very externally. But I told you, now the state is gathering all the power to itself. And if it's Europe, they want a police state, which doesn't mean like Hitler. Police state means that the government regulates everything for the better, because they know better for you than you know for you. That's the idea behind it. Because we have college-educated people, bureaucrats, and you're too dumb to know what's good for you, which is often the case, although it provokes reactions, as we all know from Corona. But anyway, that's what happened. It'll grow. In the beginning, they accommodated Nod Yehuda. It was only two hours a day, and he got to rule in the teachers and all the rest of it. And it's like, let's put it this way, 90% Jewish studies, 10% secular studies. But as the process goes, it'll reverse. It'll be 90% secular studies, and then 99% secular studies and 1% Jewish studies. That's what happened. Meanwhile, this is in the late 1700s. Independent of this, a small but important Haskalah movement, or trend, had already started in the circle associated with Moses Mendelssohn in Prussia. So Austria is down here, and Prussia is north of that, in Berlin. And over there, around the personality of Moses Mendelssohn, you started to have young people especially, a number of them, who want to be enlightened. The Haskalah here means the Jewish Enlightenment movement. For our purposes tonight, let us say that the Haskalah represented, and I did a series on this years ago, if you remember, represented the first time Ashkenazic Jews came to oppose cultural insularity in principle. That's what it means. Okay? Some did, some didn't over the course of the centuries, but in principle, now there's a movement like that. Like I say, it starts with Mendelssohn in there. So basically, let's go to the next one. The 4 pillars I always talk about, you have fundamentalism, nomism, autonomous, of course, communities, and cultural insularity. These are the 4 legs that Judaism stood on for 1,000 years and more, right? Well over 1,000 years. And cultural insularity was a major element in this, because it meant they'll stay Jewish. Maybe they didn't live so well, maybe they lived so well. The truth is, most Jews most of the time probably live better than most non-Jews live most of the time. Okay? So, you tell the Ramah, who's living very comfortably, so you don't have a secular education. He says, I don't need it. I have a Jewish education, and I have enough money to support a prosperous lifestyle. Okay? Now, fundamentalism means you believe in God, you believe the Torah is real. Nomism, you believe in following halacha to the nth degree. This is what the Jews always followed. But the Haskalah movement now challenges number 4 in principle. Now, you could have a chair that sits on 3 legs, not 4, but it's a little bit tricky, okay? If you take off another one, I don't think the chair can hold so well on 2 legs. This is what's going to happen tonight. So, this is complex, because Moses Mendelssohn himself was older than the young people around him, and he grew up in a very frum background. His mother, when he was a kid, carried him, because he had a hunchback, to cheder. She didn't want him to hurt himself. Old school. And so he grew up with a heavy dose of traditionalism, and he walked a tightrope, meaning he was a Shomer Shabbos. He went to shul and put on tefillin every day. At the same time, he has ideas which certainly mean that you're opposed to number 4 in toto, okay? But let me put it this way. In the course of his life, he developed. First he got rid of number 4, and eventually, in later years, he got rid of number 3. Because if you believe in freedom, how can you be in favor of any kind of coercion? Any kind of religious coercion? He didn't get rid of number 1 or number 2. Right? That's not who he was. But that was just him and his upbringing. His young followers did not have his upbringing, so they dropped all 4. They dropped all 4. Even if they didn't trumpet it in Christian Germany in the 1700s, you can't say, I don't believe in fundamental, I don't believe in a God. You understand? You could go against number 2, but you couldn't go against number 1. But these maskilim that I'm talking about were few. They were harbingers. They're outliers. They didn't represent most Jews. Although they did staff the new schools that I just described, starting in Prague in the Noda Yehuda's time, that the German government set up everywhere, and they become the teachers. That's how they had a job. And they did endeavor to indoctrinate their young generation away from the four pillars. Now, everything I just told you happened up to 1789. And then things really changed because the tempo of change increased dramatically. This, of course, let's see the next one. Here you'll recognize the storming of the Bastille. 2 weeks ago was July 14th, right? So in France, it's their national holiday. And this is from Gone with the Wind. No, I'm sorry, what did I say? Tale of Two Cities, okay? Tale of Two Cities. And Gone with the Wind. But anyway, what happened? When they destroyed the Bastille, they wanted to destroy everything. The monarchy, the church, the state, as it was until then, right? I mean, it was literally what's called the French Revolution, as you can see over here, okay? And, there they are, attacking the Bastille and so on and so forth. You'll have to go home and see the rest of the movie yourself. For our purposes, tonight, what's the big impact on the Jews? The revolutionaries, who were not these people, this was the mob. The people who took control were the intellectuals. The revolutionaries were, first of all, atheists, and second of all, they're committed to what you call a secular redefinition of the state. So for the first time in Europe, you have a state which is not Christian, and says so, in principle. So what we take for granted today didn't exist. Every state, England, France, the German states, Spain, Portugal, Italy, they were all Christian states, either Catholic or Protestant, and they were there for the greater glory of God. And that's fine. And that's how they wanted to define themselves, and that's how they did define themselves. The French revolutionaries, as you see, were so violent and all the rest of it, they said, out with the old, and and darkness should be abolished. And for the first time, France is going to be a secular entity. And religion has nothing to do with it. If religion has nothing to do with it, then unfortunately that means that you're going to have to give civil rights to the Jews. Because if it's a Christian state, so you see it's only for Christians. But if it's a state for everybody who's living there, on what basis do you exclude the Jews? Why, they have a different religious belief? It doesn't work for a secularist. Now, the French did not want to do it. And it was a case of the head versus the heart. And they said, we hate the Jews and this and that. They said it. But, following logic, they had no choice. They held their nose. And in 1790 and 1791, they gave the Jews complete and total civil rights. But it was a quid pro quo, like I told you before, because this is Europe, this is not America. It wasn't expressly there in the law, but it's very definitely implied. As the famous expression goes from one of the French legislators, for the Jews as Jews, we give nothing. For the Jews as Frenchmen, we give everything. Okay? So in other words, if you want to become French and drop your Jewish nationality and just totally blend in, so the only difference is that this guy goes to church and you go to synagogue, but that's the only difference at all, okay. Otherwise, we don't want to give you civil rights. You don't deserve it. This explicit, implicit thing reflects the conflictedness in the French revolutionaries. You see, on the one hand, human rights are supposed to be part of natural law. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. Who made that? God or nature? You see? Or nature. Everybody should be free, everybody should equal, and everybody should get along with each other. So if that's true, I should be able to dress any way I want, practice anything, as long as I don't hurt somebody, right? And do anything I want, and you should honor my dignity as a human being, right? In other words, theoretically, it should be like Thomas Jefferson, because that's what Jefferson said. Now, in America, there were 2,000 Jews in the whole country, so it didn't matter at the time of Jefferson. But his ideas, and he lived in France for a while, didn't he? He was the American ambassador, as you know, the minister. So Jefferson said like this, people entitled, what does it say in the Declaration of Independence? Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, including which life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's quite a statement. You're endowed by the Creator. It means that man was created by God to be free, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That means I don't tell you what to do. You can do whatever you want, as long as you don't hurt anybody and it works out, for society. You get it? In other words, as long as you, so to speak, pay your way. That's in America. But to be perfectly honest, even in America, but much more so in Europe and much in France, Jews, it's a different thing. I'm in favor of all human rights, not for the Jews. Right? They're different. They're particularly bad. They're particularly obnoxious. And so they have these bad traits and so on and so forth. Matter of fact, Voltaire, let's go to the next one, who was the great philosopher and was the inspiration for the French revolutionaries. Voltaire says, I believe in complete religious freedom, but not for the Jews. Because the Jew ripped me off. That's what he said. So skipping a million details, there emerges what I'm trying to get across tonight as the European model of emancipation. And that is heavily implied quid pro quo. So you get your rights if you pay a price. Not you get your rights because you're a person. Okay? Now, by the way, inconsistency is not rare. Thomas Jefferson, all people are created equal. He didn't mean black people. He was a slave owner, as you know. You understand? I get it. So, same thing, Voltaire said, I think everybody should be free and have religious freedom, but he didn't mean the Jews. Now, he was dead by the French Revolution, but they were all his Talmidim and inspired by him and so forth. Now, I will say that they did not write that in law, that you get your citizenship if you changed. It was Ma'aseh Kona L'Tanai, as they say. They gave a law, and they said all Jews are now completely equal and complete full citizens along with everybody else. After that, they said, maybe we went a little bit too far. The Jews are, and maybe they're what you call Torah al-Rishonos. Maybe we had second thoughts about this. So I'm describing a model which hits the Jews in Europe, which is where all the Jews live. There are only 3,000 Jews in America, about 2,500 maybe. It's different than the USA model. The American model of emancipation developed along different lines completely. And in this country, there never was passed a law giving the Jews civil rights. Instead, due to the quirks of Americanism, the Constitution said that the United States government cannot make any law involving any religion, which automatically, through the back door, gave the Jews civil rights. You see? At least at the federal level. The Europeans never do spell it out in detail. They never spell it out in law, that we want the Jews to assimilate this much in clothing, in beliefs, in practice, in education, whatever. Because really, they wanted the Jews to disappear. To amalgamate, it was called. In other words, what they really would say is like this: can't you stop being Jewish? Right? Just stop being Jewish. Become like us. Either a Christian or an atheist or something like that. But you can't say it. Right? So the Jews can never assimilate enough. Because whatever you do, you're still not there yet. But the process in France definitely commences after 1791, when the French Revolution is going on. They're chopping everybody's head off, and anybody's a rabbi, just like anybody's a priest, will get his head chopped off, and you had to go along, and wars broke out. It's too much to go into now. I will simply say that this was a shock to everybody, that in the 1700s, even at the end of the 1700s, a European country, and especially one like France, which has always been so anti-Jewish and so Catholic, all the rest of it, flipped and changed so radically that they gave the Jews complete and total civil rights. Europe was like, whoa, what happened over here? And to make it worse, Europe attacked France, and France beat them and conquered Europe. That's the story of the 1790s and the early 1800s. The French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleon. That's how Napoleon became famous, being a French general. Okay? So what happened? Let's go over here. What do you call it? The French immediately took over the Rhineland and Belgium and part of Italy. And anyway, by the time it's over, all this is the French Empire. So Napoleon rules a huge amount of Europe, and this part was like stooges under him. They were like satellite powers. You understand? So the French conquered a big part of Europe. And wherever they did, they imposed their laws on there. And part of the laws are the Jews have civil rights now. So really, this was beyond anybody's expectation. And How's this going to affect the Jews? It was hard for the Europeans to swallow, but it's complicated because Napoleon, when he takes over as the French emperor in the early 1800s, once he takes over, he really disliked the Jews. And he said, the French Revolution was a good idea. Maybe we went a little bit too far. Maybe we made a mistake giving the Jews civil rights. And he convoked the Sanhedrin. We talked about this in the past. Meaning he called a bunch of rabbis and Jewish community leaders from all over France and Italy. And he said, what are you? Are you Jews or are you Frenchmen? Which means it's not a Thomas Jefferson thing where you're entitled to rights because you're a human being. We let you into the club, the French club. But did we do the right thing or not? Because after all, you Jews consider yourselves a separate people, do you not? So why should you be entitled to any rights? And what's really happening over here is a secular European attempt to define Judaism in European terms, which is true down till today. If you tell somebody not Jewish, and by the way, this is happening now in the Gaza war, okay? Is Judaism a religion? Is Judaism a nationality? Is Judaism an ethnicity? Is Judaism, a club? It's kind of like all those. It's all those. But a Westerner said like this, no. You're messing up my survey. I'm asking you a question. Is it a religion or is it a nationality? You see? And the Jews are like this, you've got these Western boxes that you evolved over here. We come from the Middle East. We don't have those kind of boxes. We are an amalgam of all these. It's just who we are. Because the Jewish religion at its core, before Reform Judaism came along, at its core has a historical narrative going back to Avraham Avinu. And the Bible is all about, the Jews. The Old Testament is. And how do you divorce that peoplehood and nationality and all that sort of thing from the monotheistic ideas and all the rest of it? But the Europeans don't want to hear that. The French don't want to hear that. Napoleon doesn't want to hear that. And so he's trying to define Judaism in secular terms, in European terms, but can it be done? For the first time, the question is asked, are the Jews a religious confession, meaning what we call a purely religious movement, or a distinct nation? And the implication, of course, is if it's a religious confession, then you can have civil rights. But if it's a distinct nation, then you can't be French, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you can't say, I'm a Catholic. There's all kinds of different Catholics. Because that's the way Europe evolved. That there were different groups, and they're all Christians, and they fight each other, right? Have there been wars between France and Spain, for example? Boy, they're all super Catholic. So what? You understand? You can have the same religion and have wars. The idea that we're all part of one club, but then we won't fight each other, that was not part of the European way of thinking. And so historically, in the old days, the Jews, they were both. That's how Judaism regards itself. That's how Jews always self-define. We're a religion, we're a people, we're a nation, we're this, that, and we're all the above. Check all the boxes. But now, beginning the dawn of the modern era, the Jews are being asked to redefine themselves. And this is the big challenge and the big change of the modern era. It was the Europeans were giving the Jews a demand for radical assimilation, which means the conscious self-effacement of Jewish identity. The conscious mental radical surgery, otherwise no civil rights. So if you consider yourself a nation until now, you got to stop. Just change it. How do I do it? Just do it. Otherwise, we're going to pull the civil rights. Okay? So you have to do mental surgery. Because remember, it's a different nation. Why should you get civil rights? So this civil rights business in Europe turned out to be not a simple one-way street where the Jews from now on were going to be treated more nicely. Rather, it was a two-way street in which the Jews had to agree to change and assimilate, and even to change Jewish essentials in order to qualify for liberty. But if the Jew changes essential aspects of his identity, is he still Jewish? Right? This is the big question in the modern era. If you change essential aspects, what makes you, which is essential, are you still Jewish? Is civil rights worth it? The Chassam Sofer, famous used to give speeches. He said, it's not worth it. Don't give up being Jewish in order to get civil rights. But nobody listened to him. Because who wants to live in a ghetto? And who wants to live with all kind of crazy laws? I get it. And who wants to have suffer this, that, and the other? But you're giving up your birthright for a pot of porridge, like Esau. You see? I didn't want to hear it. So now we're talking about taking assimilation to new levels. It wasn't what we talked about in the previous lectures, which you selectively appropriate from the surrounding culture, you reconstitute it in Judaic form, and you end up still modifying and adjusting, but retaining your essentials. Now they want change in the essentials, okay? Now the French Jews, anxious to escape the ghetto and its legal disability, said basically they shoot the bull, okay? What did the Sanhedrin say to, what did these rabbis and community leaders say to Napoleon? We're Frenchmen above all. We're just a religious confession. We have no national component whatsoever. Including famous. Did they mean it? Did they mean it? You understand? Who do you regard more as your brother? Napoleon said. A fellow Jew or a fellow Frenchman? Oh, definitely a fellow Frenchman. You see? And a whole bunch of questions like that. Now, really, at that time, the Ashkenazi Jews don't mean it. They just say it. Okay? So, this was the president of Sanhedrin, David Zinsheim, a big gadol, very famous Talmud Chacham. But he had to go along and say, listen, we're just a religion, and we got nothing else in there. What's he supposed to say? And the people criticized him. The Chassam Sofer has a very famous hesped, a eulogy for him, and said, listen, leave the guy alone. He tried his best. He was in very bad circumstances. And I'll show you something tragic. Because Napoleon made him chief rabbi of France. And so if he's chief rabbi of France, when he dies, you get buried in Arlington National Cemetery. You don't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. You're a chief rabbi, your official position. So this is his grave in a French cemetery, in Père Lachaise. You understand? And he's stuck. He's stuck. So there's a living example of somebody being a carbon to assimilation. Because believe me, he was a super from, he was like Talmud of Shagas Aryeh, he wrote Sfarim, blah, 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 all that kind of, he was one of the Gedolim. But this is the situation if you live in France. He didn't live in Russia. He lived in France, you see? And so, in the beginning, the Ashkenazi Jews in places like France don't mean it. But by the time you get to their grandchildren, they mean it. You get later on in the 1800s, after they've gone through French education and all this indoctrination and everything around them, you mean it, okay? And used to be Jewish jokes about this. How's it go? Two guys, Yankel and Shmerel, leave Russia, Lithuania, and they go west looking to improve their fortune. Yankel ends up stopping in Germany, and Shmerel ends up going all the way to Paris. And 25 years go by, and he got rich in business, and he got rich in business. And they both meet in a hotel, in a Jewish hotel in Switzerland. Oh, I haven't seen you in 25 years, this and that and the other. And he was successful on this, he was successful on that. And the one in Germany says to the one in France, he said, why are you looking at me with such a bad face? We used to be chavrusas, and we shared time together and all the rest. And he says, I cannot forgive you for taking Alsace-Lorraine away from us. You understand? That was in the French-German wars. So, two Litvaks. By the time you get to grandchildren, on the other hand, it's not so simple. In France, the Jews do not change the siddur. You understand? They don't take away and things like that. They don't say, they don't take away the passages in the liturgy that talk about a future messianic hope. They don't translate it into French. So you have a glorious inconsistency, at least at the level of official Judaism. Now, by the way, in France, and I didn't think of putting it up here, the Judaism heavily assimilates without going all the way into reform. So you will have organs in the synagogues. The French rabbis will dress exactly like French priests. If you see pictures of the chief rabbis and stuff like that in France, like a curé, like a French Catholic priest. And, the sermons, of course, there's a lot of it, it's very assimilated, but not all the way. Not all the way. And by the way, France will be a very weak area for Zionism later on. Herzl will be the correspondent in Paris. But the French Jews, not the Eastern European Jews in Buddha, but the French Jews still say, we don't need a homeland, we have a homeland. Thank you very much. You understand? So listen, we're now dealing with things we haven't seen before in this lecture. Despite Napoleon's 10-year commission, because Napoleon in 1808 said, I think this idea that Jews getting civil rights needs rethinking. So he appointed a commission to study this for 10 years and give him a report. So, in other words, in 1818, he was going to go and probably abolish the civil rights for the Jews. But he was kicked out in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, and by again 1818 he wasn't there anymore. And so instead, what happens is the king came back, the fat King Louis the 18th, and he needed big money from, guess who this is? Rothschild, right? James Rothschild. And he was the one lending the French government the money. He's the one who kept the credit going. Because they would have, the nobles who were very improvident with the money and all the rest of it. And so everything depended on government loans. And the bottom line is like this. The commission never met, they never issued a report, and what happened in 1791 was never overturned. Although there were constant movements throughout the next century to overturn it. Okay? A lot of people in France said it was a mistake, and the Jews are not really French, and I don't care what they say they are, and I don't care what they do they are, and we should take them back to the old situation, go back to the ghetto. Now, France did not pull back on the civil rights, but the rest of Europe did, okay? The rest of Europe said, after Napoleon fell from power, and they went back to the Metternich system, the old restoration, that you're a nation, you're not a religion, and therefore, you shouldn't get rights like Germans, you're not German. You shouldn't get rights like Italians, you're not Italian, and so forth. Now the Jews at that time, in Germany, having tasted freedom for a few years, it was very hard to go back into jail. You understand? It was hard to go back into jail. As a result, for the first time in their history, the German Jews started to give a damn what the non-Jews thought of them. Because until then, they were like the Hasidim. They lived their lives, they dressed their way, they have their customs all over Germany, north, south, east, and west. And now, they care. And they said, listen, we are German. The Goyim said, no, you're not. Yes, we are. This went on for 55 years, from 1850 to 1870. The German Christians said to them, right? You talk different, you dress different, you educate different, you socialize with each other, you pray different, you think different. So how can you say you're German? Why should we give you civil rights? The Jews said, so to speak, we'll change. And they do. This is when they invent the Yeke. It never existed before the 1800s. Here's a new kind of assimilation. They give a darn what the Gentiles think about him, and they accommodate, these criticisms. So, for example, you talk different because they used to talk German Yiddish. No, we'll learn German, and they do. You dress different. Well, we'll dress like you do, and they do. You educate different. We'll send their kids to German schools and universities and all that, and they do. You socialize with each other. If you let us join the lodges and the other communities, we want to join. Okay? You pray different. This is a hard one. The Reform will say we'll change that. Right? That's where the Reform Judaism will come. Right? We'll do it in German. We'll get rid of the prayers. Listen, we can't go all the way and become a church, but we can get 90% of the way. You see? You think different. Once we go to your schools, we won't think different. And so this, by the way, this feeling among the overwhelming majority of German Jews, not all, but the great majority, that we want to change to earn civil rights and live like human beings, happened to dovetail, to come at the same time, with another trend, which was the decline of the old system of chinuch in Germany, Western Europe. The old system was the cheder, which, as we know, throughout history, was the indoctrinator of the four pillars, without using those words. What did they teach in the cheder? Fundamentalism, nomianism, cultural insularity. What's the language of the cheder? It ain't Polish, it ain't French, it ain't German. Wherever there was, right? It's all Yiddish Institute. So your whole education is in Yiddish, and a Jewish Yiddish too. In other words, from Yiddish, with a lot of expressions from not the modern secular Yiddish that they invented 100 years ago, the old Yiddish, which heavily full of Gemara and the Chumash and things like that. That was the cheder. And most importantly, the cheder is what instilled religious passion and piety. Because what did you learn in the cheder? is not even the text so much, it's the attitude. Now, look, many cheder stink, and that's a fact. A lot of them were bad, but many were not. And despite pedagogical shortcomings, because they didn't have modern textbooks and all the rest of it, the old cheders did service. What do I mean by that? They transmitted the tradition from generation to generation, and nobody wanted to leave the fold, especially as bastions of cultural insularity, and therefore as bastions of Jewish survival as Jews. What's the point of giving your kid a good education if as a result of that, he'll convert and become a Christian? So what's the point? What's the point in America of somebody giving their kid a great education in an elite school if the result of that is they'll marry out? What's the point? How do you have your priorities? You see? So the cheder represented that kind of priority. But under the impact of what I'm talking about, throughout the West, the cheder is going to die out, and it will not be replaced by anything similar. It will not be replaced by day schools. And even day schools like, Frisch or Maimonides or something like that, It won't be replaced by day schools. Herein lies the tale. One of the mega trends of modernity is the new economics. In other words, when we talk about the modern era, besides what a country did or anything, certain massive mega trends swept Western Europe and then the rest of the world. It just happened. That's what we call modernity. And one of the most important of them is economics. Basically, it's the replacement of the guilds by capitalism. In the Middle Ages, and I've talked about this many times in the past, they had a different system we have today. If I have a pizza shop, and I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, and I've lived here all my life, and let's say my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived here, and they had a pizza shop, and they had a pizza shop, I'm entitled under medieval laws that no one else can open a pizza shop and compete with me. Provided that I'm not cheating anybody, I'm giving, what do they call it, the fair product for a just price, something like that. So in other words, I'm not over charging anybody. I'm a shoemaker. I do a good job with shoemakers. I learned it from my father. He learned it from his father. He learned it from his father. And every shoe you're going to get is a custom tailored shoes. That's a fact. And there'll be good leather and all the rest of it. And when you need a replacement, I'm the shoemaker and all that. Does there even exist shoemakers anymore? In our society, very few, right? That was the thing. So if that's the case, and I'm a good citizen of this town, and my family's been here and so on and so forth, it's only fair that I should be protected against competition, because somebody could cut me out and put me and my family out on the street, and that would not be right. It's the old medieval Catholic doctrine. You understand? You're entitled to protection of your livelihood, provided that you're not, abusing it. So in every town in Europe, there's like one barber, one baker, one butcher, one baker, one candlestick maker, one hooper, one cooper, one whooper. You name it, right? Or maybe two. But that's it. And in order to become a barber or a butcher or anything else, you got to join a guild. And you have to be a journeyman, an apprentice, and you got for 20 years. It don't take 20 years to learn to be a barber. And you have to marry a barber's daughter. You see? So what's that all about? Protecting the status quo, which I understand. Now, it makes sense perhaps in a moral thing. And by the way, I'm talking now about Jewish assimilation. The Ashkenazi Jews assimilated this idea in some places in the Middle Ages. There's a big machlokas between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, grandfather and grandson. Is there such a thing called a cheskas hayishuv? Which means, do we, in Judaism, can a kehillah pass a law exactly along the lines I'm saying? Cheskas hayishuv means you can't even live in this town unless we say it's okay. Anybody can blackball you. Why would I blackball anybody? Because I'm a tailor and so are you. I don't want you in town competing with me. You see? And I always forget which one said which, but those are big people, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. One said there is a cheskas hayishuv, and one said there's not. And that would be an example of the Jews in their way filtering through in Jewish law an idea that you get from Catholic Europe. But this system is economically retarding. It holds things back. You get it? Because there's only one barber, one baker, one shoemaker. How many people can there be in a town? One thing they definitely don't want is people should move into town. Because if we let people come into town, some darn fool is going to start giving haircuts in the back alley. and undercutting me. Some guy's going to surreptitiously sell pizza out of his house or out of a cart. That's when he invented cities and the police to keep the peasants and everybody out, except for market day and all the rest of it. But starting in the 1700s and picking up steam in the 1800s, everything I just told you got tossed aside. First it started in England. When we were kids, we learned it, they called it the Industrial Revolution. That's what that means. It's really what I just described. And when you get rid of that, you say we're replacing the old rules with the law of the economic jungle. In other words, if I'm selling pizza and you sell for 10 cents less than me, I'll go broke. Who cares? My family be out in the street. They'll starve to death. We don't give a darn. It's the law of the jungle. Because overall, pizza will be cheaper and more people open pizza stores. That'd be more employment. And it also meant that the government was saying it was fought. But this happened, first in England, but there were fights about this, as you can imagine. But what they're saying is like this: anybody can do anything, as long as you're not hurting somebody. So that means me, myself, and I. If I can persuade 10 people to lend me $20,000 or $30,000, whatever it is, I can do the following: I can open up something called a factory, and I can hire peasants to come from the countryside and tell them how to mass produce shoes, and I can sell those shoes. I'm going to put every shoemaker out of business, the way that Amazon right now is putting all the little stores out of business. But the public isn't complaining because the public gets served better. And now, instead of getting one shoe a year or two shoes a year, which are very well built, a lady can buy 10 and 20 shoes a year, right? And if they run out, if they run out, then you buy some more. That's what it is. And so all I'm trying to say is, this was a trend that nobody foresaw, but it happened. And it happens again at the beginning of what we call the modern era. It's one of the main characteristics of the modern era. And it leads to unintended consequences. And the most important one we're talking about is urbanization. And by that I mean, if what I just said is true, then the old rules in which nobody can move into town, every town's a few thousand people, we don't want a lot of people living here, is replaced by a different model. I'm an industrialist, I got some money together, I'm hiring workers, come and live in the town, and you women who come from the countryside, and 2 cents is a lot of money, where you come from. So I'm paying you 3 cents a month. Whoa, that's big money where you come from. All of a sudden the town fills up with tens of thousands of people, with hundreds of thousands of people, and eventually with millions of people. So in the 1800s, most people don't realize this, is when cities happened. I mean, cities like you and I understand it, okay? Which is aggregations of vast numbers of people, and to facilitate the industrialization. And so, how big was New York City when George Washington was inaugurated there in April of 1789? The answer is 13,500. Okay? That was NYC, New York City. Now, how big was New York City in 1900, 100 years later? Millions. Okay? London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Rome, and so forth, right? Those are the big cities, and a lot of little cities are 500,000. Baltimore, Maryland was a 500,000, and eventually we came close to being close to 1 million once upon a time. Now it's shrunk. That's because of industrialization, because there's no holds barred. Now the workers are exploited, and that's true, and you have the sweatshops and all that kind of business, and it's terrible, and that leads to socialism and communism, but it happened. So my point is like this. There arises a new phenomenon called the city. And this was the golden age of the civil engineers, wasn't it? You tell me you're going to make a place with 500,000 people, 1 million people? How's that work? How are you going to build the houses? More importantly, how are you going to provide the toilets? Right? And the running water. And the food distribution. And the transportation. And how are you going to prevent people from banging into each other? And so forth and so on. That's why you had to build the big sewers and the other works, things like this. It was the golden age of civil engineers. And they have the new infrastructure. And by the way, it was a marvel. It was a marvel. Because usually in the old days, if you get a lot of people together, you immediately have a magefa, a plague. How do you have it in modern time? You have to have something called health measures, okay, sanitary laws, and all this kind of stuff. One of the many things they invent when you have the city is something called public school. Because you don't want people walking around that can't read any signs, all the rest of it. Even the capitalists want their workers to get a sixth grade education so they can see, stop, start, enter, leave. Not more than that. You don't want to know too much. But they should read the signs. Otherwise, you pull the wrong thing. You get it? So that's why this capitalist world sets up this non-capitalist thing called free education. I thought they didn't give anything away for free. But education, they do at least at the elementary level. And it's free and efficient. Because in the 1800s, that was the golden age of the old school, in which if you misbehave or burp, what do? Beat the heck out of you. And when you come home, your parents beat you again, right? Every teacher in the 1800s has the stick, doesn't he? Or she, okay? So there was no behavior problems. And even secondary schooling is rather inexpensive in the 19th century. And if you live in a place called United States of America, which most Jews didn't live at that in the time I'm talking about, they even created something that nobody else had, which was free high school. That's Noah Webster, okay? Now, starting him as because they said it's just good to have enlightened people, free high school. And if you actually come to live in a city called New York City, you even have a free college, don't you? Right? Think about that. You can go from K to bachelor's degree for free. This was a city college, once upon a time, not now. And people took advantage of it. That's why so many people moved to New York. It's one of the reasons so many people moved to New York. Now, here's my point. The Jews are part of the urbanization. Think about the 1800s in the following way. In every place in Europe, people are constantly streaming from the countryside into the city. There's not much of a future in the countryside. Everybody sees a future in the city. Now, usually the future blows up in their face, and they end up in sweatshops and, in tenements and things like that. That is true. But they all look for this. So that means, I told you before, you have all of a sudden something that never existed before. 1 million people, 500,000 people in one area. Right? That's just a different type of living. So if you're Jewish, you have the Jewish equivalent of that, which is not necessarily 1 million people, but 50,000, 100,000, something like that. This never existed. How big was Vilna in the time of the Vilna Gaon? Jewish, 2,500. Okay? How big was Troy in the time of Rashi? 20 families, 30 families. That's usually what it was. How big was Frankfurt in the time of Chassam Sofer? 2,000. It was 2-3 blocks. 2,500. Same thing for Venice. These were considered big communities. Usually a kehillah, a small Dorf's kehillah, shtetl, it's a few people. In that kind of environment, the old kehillah system can work. It's like being in a shul today. You kind of all know each other, and you can regulate each other, sort of. You'll have some fights, but you can regulate each other. How do you have a shul of 100,000 people, of 50,000 people? The Jews never had evolved a form of government that could handle such a large business, right? And they can't do it. So look at this. These are Jewish communities. By the time you get to the 1900 or so, 2 million in New York, 180,000 in London, 100,000 in Paris, 100,000 in Vienna, 300,000 in Budapest. That's a lot of Hungarians. And Berlin is 160,000. This, once upon a time in Berlin, there were 160 Jews. You see? Then you can have a kehillah, or several times 160. 160,000? It's not possible. You see? It's beyond. Okay. So now kehillahs historically were deficient in the old days in chinuch. I know it sounds funny, but the old kehillah in the old days used to have a synagogue, a cemetery, a mikvah, some kind of kashrus, call it avada kashrus, an eruv, things like that. They never had, and these were paid out of communal money. You understand? So the kehillahs used to tax everybody, and there's a budgetary process, and so much goes for the shul, and so much goes for the pay the rabbi and the dayan and the cemetery and this, that, and the other. That's how you did it. Okay, that's how you had to. A lot of it goes to the government for taxes, right? This is why in the old country you never had more than one synagogue, or maybe two, because it's a waste of money. You get what I'm saying? Don't tell me I don't like Shomri, I don't like Ner Dama. Who cares what you like? We're not spending communal money so you can have a private minyan. You get it, it's that way. In America, everything's, private, so you can do what you want. So my point is that the Kehillah is never provided for schooling for cheder. You're on your own. So if somebody had kids, you just went to some Malamed or something like that, and you cut your own deal. And there's no contract. And if I don't like the way you're doing it, I yank my kid. If I like it, I keep the kid. And yeshiva is the same thing. So it was always the Achilles heel, but it didn't matter. Why? Because everybody lived in small communities. Just like in the movies. The small community has always in history been the most efficient reinforcer of social norms. Do you get what I just said? Right? Why? No privacy, baby. You get it? You're going along. You're not deviating. Not if you live in the community. And I already know what girl you're going to marry, and I know what you're going to be when you grow up, and I know this and that and the other, because you can't hide. Right? The whole Peyton place. Everybody knows everything that's going on with everybody. You can't do it. And so watch this. I haven't seen you in shul the last 2 days. How often can you say you got a cold? The kosher butcher says like this, I haven't seen you in some time. The mikvah lady is saying, I haven't seen you in some time. There's no privacy. You get it? By the way, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, that's around the world. The small community, because of lack of privacy, is the most powerful reinforcer of social norms. Now, by the way, there's a plus and a minus to that, right? Let's put it this way. Would you want your aged parent to live in a large city, an apartment by himself or herself, or in a small community, in a village? In the village, everybody say like this, where's Harry? He's not at the coffee shop. Every morning he's at the coffee shop. Let's go to the house and check it out. Right? In a city, I haven't seen you. I live in an apartment building. I don't want to know who's the next door neighbor. Might be Ted Bundy. If I haven't seen him, I ain't saying a word. You get it? My friend lives across town, and that's the only one I deal with. Because I don't know who you are. And it's true. You understand? So we have what they call the lonely crowd. Who was it? C. Wright Mills, the lonely crowd. You have 50,000 people in the baseball stadium, and there's a whole mass of people together, and nobody knows each other. So are you a part of a community? But that's the city, as opposed to the little village. You see, little town. So now, in the new urban reality, Jewish community leaders needed to copy the Catholics and set up day schools, providing both Hebrew and English. Because the Catholics figured this out earlier, because they have a dedicated clergy who have nothing else to do all day long but think about the faith, and therefore, right, and they have nuns and priests, they really do. And so they faced this problem. I'll give you an example. USA. All these Irish people started coming in the late 1700s, early 1800s to America. They usually moved very often to the frontier. There it's all Scotch-Irish, a Protestant. They ended up marrying Protestant girls, and they went off to Derech. Catholic Church is freaking out. Headquarters of Catholic Church was Baltimore, Maryland. Okay? And so what they said is, we're going to set up something called Catholic schools, K through 12, and they even go to an MD and PhD. And by the way, Fordham is a good school. Georgetown is a good school. Notre Dame is a good school. They provide, can I say Hebrew and English? Catholic and English. And we'll keep them in the fold, but we'll also give them a parnasa. You see? So it can be done. And today, in the Orthodox order, they call day schools, it's the same thing. But nobody figured that out in the 1800s. That's just the way it went. The Jewish communities utterly failed to do so, with the rarest of exceptions. One of the most famous things about Samson Raphael Hirsch is he made a day school. And even, shockingly, for boys and girls. You see? Because he was born in a modern, quote-unquote, family, and they're very religious. But he said, it's a new day. If you don't have something called day school and the rest of it, they'll just go to public school or to go to Christian school and goodbye. But he was a loner, right? There were a few, very few, what you and I would call day schools in Germany, very few. And public schools are good in those days. And public school is a key to economic prosperity. And public school is compulsory. And it was secular, non-sectarian. So Jewish parents who are moving now by the hundreds of thousands to the cities will enroll their kids there. The school is 2 blocks away from my house, 3 blocks away from my house. It's a good school. They won't indoctrinate you in Christianity. At least they say they won't. Okay? And, everybody else is going there. And that way you'll make a parnasa. The parents moving from shtetls and wherever, they figure their kids will remain Jewish. They'll just be secular educated. Naively, the parents think or hope their kids will employ what Jews have always employed, selective appropriation and hopefully Judaic reconstitution. And so they'll go through K through 12 and through college, but they'll still remain religious Jews. They'll just pick up the math, the science, and this, that, and the other. But whereas that did happen in the past when Jews lived either physically or mentally in ghettos, voluntary ghettos, now, in the 1800s, the kids are going to be educated in the exact opposite. In foreign territory. In other words, where's your kid going to school? Not on Jewish ground. The public school is not Jewish ground. Now, TA is Jewish ground. Beis Yaakov is Jewish ground. Beth Tefillah is Jewish ground. You understand? Physically, you're going to a Jewish place. These kids aren't doing that. They're going to foreign ground, and there's schools that are not Jewish. And education, it turns out, doesn't only mean teaching cold facts. That's part of it. But that's not all you get for school education. Education in public schools is also about indoctrination, inculcation of ideas, inculcation of values. Don't you agree? And by the way, we want this. I want the public schools to teach democracy, tolerance, freedom. You want that. So it's not only, 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's not only biology. You want them to convey ideas. But are they your ideas? Okay? Education is all about indoctrination, inculcation of ideas, inculcation of values. Education is the powerful tool of socialization in the modern era, replacing the family and church. The kids, come out. Let me put it this way. You spend a lot more time with your teachers than you do with your family and friends. That's how it goes. And therefore, the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on you is going to be the school. And you're socialized to what? To be a Frenchman, to be a German, to be American, to be Italian. You're not socialized in public school to be a Jew. So where are you supposed to get that from? In the 19th and 20th centuries, schools will also inculcate nationalism. Okay? Nationalism is a belief that the nation is a real thing, and that indeed equals more than the sum of its parts, and it's worth dying for. This will be indoctrinated into the kids. Otherwise, people would not have fought in World War II. You see? Is there a thing called America? From a strictly scientific point of view, there is no such thing, right? No, it's from a cold, hard, science-based, factual thing. There's a bunch of people who live in this country. A bunch of human beings. But there is America. See? We all feel it. Or there's France. Or Mother Russia. They don't actually exist. But if everybody subscribes to it, it exists. You see? And by the way, Mother Russia is worth dying for. Francis, he died for the glory of France. Or the glory of England. It's interesting. I'm not talking about, this is a tricky business. The soldiers who are dying in Israel now are not dying for the glory of Israel. They're dying for life and death. They say, if we don't take these guys out, they're going to come in and kill us all. Right? In Eretz Yisrael, Ein Breira, as they call it. You know, Israel's not glorious flag waving and that kind of stuff. They don't believe in that kind of materialism. That's not a Jewish value. We're fighting in Israel for life and death. And October 7th demonstrates that, as you know. Right? So you're fighting for Klal Yisrael, but it's for something tangible here now. But the notion that the nation as a collective is greater than the sum of its parts. These are ideas. You can agree with them, you can disagree with them. They're notions, but they're indoctrinated. Mind you, the Jewish students will not get Jewish nationalism in the public schools. Jewish nationalism would be dual loyalty. Hence, the principled rejection of Jewish nationalism by most secular educated Jews, certainly in the 19th century. When Herzl and other Zionists start, most Jews say, no, we don't want to, especially in Germany and France and Italy and those kind of places. No, and America and the Reformed Jewish movement in this country, all the rest of it. No, Washington is our Jerusalem. You see, because that's what they learned in schools. So we're talking now about assimilation in a big way. This trend that I described now about schooling is the most important factor in the abandonment of the four pillars by the masses in the 19th century. It's not that some reform rabbi let everybody off the derech or one of those kind of things. That's not what happened. It's a mega trend. You're an immigrant. You come to Baltimore, Maryland in 1890 from a shtetl, and you got 3 kids, and you live downtown, and you're trying to make a living, and you want the kids to make a living. There is no day school. It doesn't exist. So you send your kid to public school, and you hope. And you hope. And 9 out of 10 times, the public schooling and the college after that will be successful in the Parnassa sense. That's the story of American Jewry. But I can't say 9 out of 10 times it'll be successful in the Jewish sense. It's what happens. So it's nobody's fault, except collectively speaking, the Jews themselves. But you can't, point to anybody. Now, entire generations of kids, therefore, were going to be socialized into Gentile physical environments and in Gentile culture and Gentile thinking. So you get a very good education in this country, in American history and values, and in Americanism, and all that. Not in Jewish. That's all. I didn't say they said anything against the Jews. I didn't say anything they're anti the Jews. And they didn't make anybody, like in Spain in the Middle Ages, go and eat treif or something like that. But you're not getting anything Jewish. Okay? Now maybe these ideas they pick them in the schools are good. Maybe the cultures are good. Maybe they're bad, but they're not Jewish. Again, the Jewish communities failed to provide their own day schools, where you could have a combination of secular education, but it would be provided on Jewish home ground by Jewish teachers and a Jewish key. And you could have there are some day schools that have an excellent secular education. Everybody goes to Harvard. Okay? And it did work, meaning public school did work in the sense that it provided the necessary minimum of assimilation that ultimately led to full emancipation by 1870. In other words, the Jews in Germany changed. And indeed, over the course of time, the Germans, I'm simplifying, but the Germans eased up and gave them civil rights. It took 50 years, but it happened. It would not have happened if the Jews continued to be Hasidic. You see, it would not have happened. So by the middle of the 19th century, many, many Jews had embraced assimilation with both arms, regarding assimilation as an essential component of their emancipation and an essential component of their entry into the modern world and the modern economy. They did not mind at all giving up the 4 pillars of fundamentalism, nomism, all the rest of it. On the contrary, on the other hand, the new assimilation faced them with 2 challenges. And here I'll be coming to the end. Faced them with 2 challenges at which they failed. I'm talking about the Jews. Number 1, redefining Jewishness. If it's not the 4 pillars, then what is it? And how do you get all the Jews to agree to your definition? Okay? And number 2, this, of course, proved impossible, right? As we shall see. So the result of assimilation was permanent Jewish fragmentation, in fact, radical fragmentation. So today, there's not Judaism, there's Judaisms, right? And by the way, some Judaisms in the USA today are in favor of Hamas. Right? In fact, one of the big problems you have in the reforming conservative, especially reforming Reconstructionists, a lot of the young rabbis coming up with the thing are very anti-Israel, very anti-Zionist. You read this. So there's not Judaism anymore, it's Judaisms. And can a helpless, landless minority survive when they're so fragmented? And number 2, assimilation was supposed to lead to the end of anti-Semitism. Indeed, assimilation was the cure in the 19th century, because that's what they thought. What's causing people to dislike us? We're so different. So we'll stop being so different. We won't talk funny, we won't dress funny, we won't act funny, and then they'll like us. Because why would they not? But it didn't happen. Okay, 1 second. It didn't happen. even, because even when the Jews bend over backwards, that doesn't mean people like to change. And it didn't mean people all of a sudden like the Jews. Here's a scene I'll show you from, it's a drama, obviously, dramatization. Rothschild, Lionel de Rothschild. You can't get more assimilated than him in England in 1859. And he was elected to Parliament a bunch of times by the City of London. It's like Wall Street area. So he was elected by the non-Jewish voters. You know what I'm saying? But every time he goes to Parliament, they say this is a Christian assembly, and and leave. You can, and this is all very civilized. So no fights or anything like that. But he made his point, okay? And you'll see, an Disraeli, who was a converted, he was now a Christian, and for a bar mitzvah present, his father converted him to Christian. I'm serious. So that's how he had a career. Otherwise, he couldn't have had a career, because the Jews did not have civil rights in England. And you'll see, he makes a speech, he says it's not right, and all the rest of this. Take a look. This is the British Parliament in 1859.
Members desirous of taking their seats will be pleased to come to the table.
That's Rothschild. If you're Jewish, you put your hat on when you make a shvuah.
I'm desirous of taking the oath from the Old Testament.
Baron Lionel de Rothschild, may withdraw.
Hit the road. This is Disraeli.
Disraeli,
Rothschild has been freely and fairly elected by the City of London as a member of this Parliament. To deny him his seat as a Jew is to punish to the world that we are still influenced by the darkest superstitions of the darkest ages that ever existed in this country.
we take our oath on the true faith of Christianity.
I cannot sit in this house with any misconceptions of my opinion on this subject. Whatever may be the results on the seat that I hold.
This is a Christian assembly.
Yes! And it is as a Christian that I will not take upon myself the awful responsibility of excluding from the legislature those in whose religion my Lord and Savior was born.
Now, he actually was able to get the law changed a little bit after this in an underhanded way. My point is, Rothschild's pretty assimilated, and he contributes to the country, and he checks all the boxes and all the rest of it. Yeah, but what do you wear a hat for? You see? And anyway, why do you want the Old Testament? You see? And I understand this. You understand where it's coming from, but you just gave up all your other Jewish stuff. You don't have the four pillars to fall back on. So get ready in the second half of the 19th century and 20th century for a lot of Jewish neurosis. They won't know how to deal with all this. But that's enough for tonight, so good night. As always, we'll daven Marv in a minute or two, or three.